evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the launch of this lovely book that you see behind you, the New Delhi Book Club. And uh, I'm glad you could all make it. And the reason that we're all here celebrating this book is because this submission landed in our inbox a little more than a year ago. And I was actually, our publisher Kartika, who's here, read the stories first and absolutely fell in love with them. And she insisted that we, the editorial team, read it too. And to be honest, I was kind of reluctant. And I told Radhika this because in the description it said that these stories were set in the time of COVID. And I, for one, was not ready to turn back and look at that time. And I thought, I didn't know what to expect. But I'm glad I went in and read these stories because while these stories are set in the time of COVID, it was an unreal time for us, right? But we all lived through it. And as it turned out, these stories were about, they were set in this small neighborhood in Delhi, and they were about, the human spirit more than anything, which can overcome the strangest of situations with the qualities that make us all human. So there were moments of kindness in this book. There were moments of humanity, faith, humor, resilience, of course. And once I was done with the manuscript, I just, felt so overcome that we had all survived this time together. And of course, we had to publish this book. And that is how this book came to be. And here it is. And we're all celebrating it today. And I'm so glad Radhika is here. And we get to launch it all with everyone. So for today's discussion, we have some esteemed guests. I'll start with the president of IHC, Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee. Ambassador Bhaswati Mukherjee joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1976 and was India's ambassador to UNESCO Paris from 2004 to 2010, and subsequently India's ambassador to the Netherlands, The Hague, from 2010 to 2013. She was elected the first woman president of India Habitat Center in March 2023. A prolific writer herself, she has authored 4 books, India and the EU, An Insider View, commissioned by the Indian Council of World Affairs, published in August 2018. Her second book was also a bestseller and was India and the EU in a Turbulent World. Her third book, Bengal and its Partition, An Inside Story, published by Rupa, released on 21st March, is a global bestseller. And her fourth book, Indenture and Its Root, A Relentless Quest for Identity, published in September 2023, is a bestseller as well. A natural orator, Ms. Mukherjee is a political commentator on TV on Indian culture and civilization, the India-EU relationship, Brexit, India's interests in the Indo-Pacific, the chemical weapons regime, nuclear issues, and the changing contours of India's foreign policy, apart from security issues of concern to India. Welcome, Ambassador. In conversation with Radhika, we have noted journalist Kaveree Bamzai, who has been in the journalism business for over 3 decades. She's also a writer, a critic, and a cultural commentator. And I'm so glad she could join us today because she's also a great conversationalist. Next, of course, I'm going to introduce the star of the show, Radhika, our author. Radhika's work explores the themes of identity and exile. Her debut novel, Where the River Parts, was chosen by Amazon India as one of their memorable books of 2016. It was also longlisted by the Authors Club for the Best First Novel Award. Her next novel, Civil Lines, was longlisted for the Tagalata Bangalore Literature Festival Best Novel Award. The New Delhi Book Club is her latest novel, and Radhika is traveling to Bangalore with it, so I'm hoping it will also soon be longlisted, shortlisted, maybe win the prize. So please welcome all three of them with a big round of applause. Will you please, Ambassador Mukherjee and Kaveree, Radhika, will you please come up on stage? We'll now unveil the book. Can we have a round of applause to welcome them? Kartika, will you also please come? Come, we have... Here, come in. There are 2 copies. Okay. Now I'd like to request Ambassador Mukherjee to please open the function with some remarks. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. It's almost like a family occasion because Radhika is what we call a foreign service child, and a lot of her proud father's batchmates are here. Her father is Ambassador Rajiv Dogra, sitting there in the front row. Ambassador Lakshmi Puri is here, Ambassador Nalin Suri, Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. So we are all very proud when second generation, Mrs. Balakrishnan and so many others. And I can recognize a few friends of mine from Miranda House also who've landed up. So welcome to all of you and my colleagues in Team Habitat. In the New Delhi Book Club, Radhika has crafted a very vivid mosaic of life during the pandemic. And I can well understand the publisher's hesitation to want to initially read it, because it was a particularly difficult time for those of us who were in Delhi and who went through the pandemic. Those memories are still very vividly etched in our minds. And Radhika's book actually serves as a powerful reminder of how the human spirit prevails over every adversity. This was an adversity or a catastrophe which none of us had ever imagined could happen. It happened. And the way people, human beings, found their way around it, including very lonely souls, including myself. I live alone, all alone, with a dog for company. The dog was actually my savior because he was my only companion. But there were a lot of very lonely people who found it very difficult to go through it. And Radhika also reminds us in her book about how people try to make the best of a bad situation. Fortunately, she didn't get stuck in the pandemic in Delhi. She was going to fly to Delhi the day the lockdown was announced in Delhi. So it was all for the best. And I can assure Radhika that her parents handled it extremely well. And as far as her dad was concerned, he used to spend his time walking 100 times around his terrace. So I asked him once, be careful, you might just feel giddy and fall down. He said, itna chota chat nahi hai bhai. It's a big chat. So I said, good. Because I used to walk in the lane outside my house. My chat is too small for walking around it. When you go through the book, you'll see there are some very touching stories. One of them, in title story, Shami, an old lonely widower, and how he strikes up a friendship with his new neighbor's 6-year-old daughter. That's really, really touching story. Then in Making Memories, she talks of Ashima, locked down in Delhi, unable to visit her hometown, and imagining what Delhi's Parathe Wale Gali would be like, just to go for a visit and have a paratha. These are very, very, very touching stories which make you remember the pandemic. What I really, really appreciated, because I saw for myself the terrible journey of the migrants, the laborers who had no jobs. Um, and as I wrote in my remarks on the book, that one of the unpleasant discoveries of the pandemic was, and I'm president of the Resident Welfare Association of my colony, which is a prosperous colony, is how some very rich people behaved in a very mean way with their domestic help, their drivers, their cooks during the pandemic, refusing to pay them, refusing to give them any rations, oblivious to the fact that it's a very difficult situation for them because they were locked in their air-conditioned homes watching Netflix. That was a very unpleasant discovery for me, actually. And then there's a colleague of ours from the Foreign Service called Pinak Ranjan Chakravarti, whose wife, Radhika, like many of the Foreign Service wives, are very talented. She's also a writer. She wrote a very beautiful poem about the pandemic and its effect on migrant labor. And I'll just read out a couple of sentences from that book. She said, "Forsaken monuments mourn, Red Fort, Qutub Minar, Jama Masjid, Nizamuddin. On empty roads, peacocks preen. On the highway, the air grows dense with migrant rage. Unhomed hordes abandon our cruel city in search of home, holding hope in work-weary hands. Bleeding footprints traverse our TV screens. From a safe distance, we watch them leave and learn. In the pandemic, new wisdom. You cannot mask our indifference. Quarantine the despair of the damned. Sanitize the bitterness of the betrayed. Lock down hunger, their longing to belong." This was Radha Chakrabarti's poem, which got an award actually. It's a longish poem. I just read out 2 verses. But I also remember the number of very dear friends I lost in the pandemic, including one who would have probably survived if he had stayed at home, but he made the decision to go to the hospital, and the oxygen ran out of his concentrator. So he died at the very steps of the hospital after a 6-hour wait to enter. He was a Foreign Service colleague and a good friend. And therefore, I think this book is a must read. And I will read out to you what got me through the pandemic, which was what Gulzar wrote. And he said, "बेवजह घर से निकलने की जरूरत क्या है, मौत से आंखें मिलाने की जरूरत क्या है। सबको मालूम है बाहर की हवा कातिल है, यूं ही कातिल से उलझाने की जरूरत क्या है। एक नेमत है जिंदगी, उसे संभाल के रख, कब्रिस्तान को सजाने की जरूरत क्या है। दिल के बहलाने को घर में ही वजह क्या है, यूं ही गलियों में भटकने की जरूरत क्या है." I hope it doesn't come back again a second time. But if it does, then at least we have some memories of how to survive if ever, God forbid, such a terrible disaster overtakes the world again. I'd like to thank Radhika for writing this book. I'd like to assure her that whatever it was like in London where she was, Delhi in its second wave was a horror which we lived through. And those who live outside, I still remember, to conclude, that a very close relative of mine who lives in Boston called me up and she said, "India is so polluted. Why are you people using Nigambodh Ghat and not electric crematoriums?" So then I told her, I said, "But I have seen on television in New York City huge pits being dug and bodies being thrown. Here at least we are cremating our dead with dignity. So we may be polluting because we don't have enough electric crematoriums, but whatever it is, India mourned its dead and let go with dignity." Thank you for writing the book, Radhika.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. Radhika, I think the ambassador really said everything that needed to be said about the book. So we'll get into the conversation right away. I think the ambassador said that it does actually bring back memories of the pandemic, but it also shows us the triumph of the human spirit. But looking around, I wonder, does actually, does anyone remember the pandemic? Because, life has just gone back to being the way it was. And have we really learned anything?
You say that, but
I think,
we're
yeah.
still
Speak into that, yeah.
we're still working virtually.
Yeah.
We still connect with people on Zoom. So there are aspects of the pandemic, so the technological advances that have stayed with us. Can you hear me?
Just a little closer, yeah.
Yeah, is this better? No, it's better. Yeah. So we have traces of the advances, technological advances made from the pandemic still with us. But in many, many other ways, there are good things that have come from the pandemic. In some ways, we're embracing life now, right? We're rushing to travel. We're rushing to meet people. We're rushing to socialize. That comes as one of the after effects of the pandemic. If you think back to the last one in 1918, the roaring 20s followed. I mean, a lot that was bad followed after that too, and maybe some of that is to come too. But there was a lot of celebration of human contact. And I hope that really is seen as something that is cherished now after the pandemic.
So this is also a kind of microcosm of society, this little world that you've created. And, you have some good neighbors, some bad neighbors, and a lot of it is like life. You have some good ones and some bad ones. So when you were writing the book, how much of it was catharsis? How much of it was pure observation? How much of it, as one of your characters says, was a pure analysis just to sort of get through the pandemic as well?
So as Ambassador Mukherjee has said, I was very far away during the pandemic. My thoughts were with my loved ones and friends in Delhi. So my thoughts naturally tended here, and I was more in touch with the news cycle than I might otherwise have been intimately involved with the news cycle, just because I was so invested in what was going on in Delhi. And at that time, I felt, look, this pandemic is going to bypass India. The news coming out of India in 2020, and it was so different in 21, but in 2020, it felt like India was immune to the virus. And so that gave me a comfort in the headspace to even approach something like this. But it allowed me also then to imagine lives, right? That lives I could not approach, people I couldn't meet, houses in the very streets I've grown up in.
Yeah.
They've all changed beyond recognition. The houses have become multi-story flats. And, one house was served by one car now has, 2, 5 cars. So everyone has changed. So all of these inhabitants are fictional. But just my distance and the fact that India was faring then relatively well with it allowed me to imagine myself back in the streets and imagine, like you said, a good neighbor, a bad neighbor. And that's universal, isn't it? So everyone has someone they like, someone they don't like, someone they'll go out of town for. And that's really what allowed me to imagine these people.
Of course, things rapidly got worse. Yeah. And you write about that as well. You write about certain anchors screaming for drugs and certain sort of the whole cycle that went on, the news cycle as well. But how much of the characters are you as well? When I was looking at Mahima, I thought perhaps a little bit of that is you. Ashima, perhaps a little bit of that her is you. Navya, the daughter, is definitely, I think, a lot of your daughter as well, and the boy in the book as well. There's a lot of there are little bits of you, I thought, everywhere. Although I don't know you, but it looked like it was a little bit of you everywhere.
Funny enough, you mentioned Mahima. There's none of Mahima in me.
I thought the idea of wanting to write and
no, I've never been a repressed writer. Maybe at some point I should have been a repressed writer, but I've never known. Some of Ashima is in me. Navya is definitely my impossible daughter, Anaya. And yes, I think The Boys Call Me Here is based on my son Manas. So I think there will always be touches of you in everything you write, everything you touch. And maybe Mahima has, though I don't identify at all with Mahima, now that you say it, maybe there is a touch of me, right? Someone who's dreaming
Yeah.
of a brighter tomorrow.
Yeah.
Someone who's
Yeah.
dreaming of a brighter tomorrow
Right.
with her husband
Yeah.
or planning for the future,
Yeah.
right? I'm sure there is part
Yeah.
of me, but yes, definitely the kids do play a starring role.
Oh, yeah,
in this,
they are. Talk a little about them, because I found them most endearing, especially the little girl. I thought she was a marvelous character. And, you find, especially in the movies, you find little girls who play those precious little girls.
Little bullies,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
They can be quite irritating, but your Navya is quite a charmer.
She is lovely, isn't she?
Yeah.
On print, yeah. She's graduated to being a tween, so she's 11 years old now. So very, very critical, constructively critical of everything. So she's sitting in London, is trying to teach me about hair care and skincare, and I'm like, dude, I'm from India. I know a bit about these, ancient recipes and remedies, but so in a way, for me, this is me literally preserving them.
Yeah.
From when they were 6 and 9, and just so much easier to deal with, and loving me more than their friends, and isolation was bearable just because we were
all together.
And it was bearable for them to be around us all the time, right? So I don't think they find it so palatable today. But then it was lovely, and it was lovely being isolated with them.
Yeah. How much of a role do books play in your relationship with your children? Words, books. I thought that's a very significant part of the relationship. And even some of the books that you mentioned, I was quickly making a note of, if my children were growing up, I would certainly introduce them to give them that reading list. But how much of that is part of your relationship with your kids?
It's a symbiotic process, right? Because they've educated me too. In fact, the Pia Maven at Westland is here, and just because she's a generation below me, she's introducing me to new words, and I must sound like a dinosaur to her when I say, what does that mean? But my
words
kids,
such as?
Oh, Pookie. Atre, where are you?
What does Pookie mean? What does it mean?
It's cute. I showed that picture to my daughter, and she's like, "That's not Pookie."
It's like Pukey?
No. It's really cute. It's really cute. So I'm glad to know I'm not the only dinosaur. But they've taught me to read. I rediscovered Harry Potter with my son. Then I discovered Philip Pullman with him. Percy Jackson, which is a series based on the Greek gods.
Right. So a very updated version, right?
Yeah, set in Manhattan, which is the new kind of Athens of the modern world. So they've introduced me to things too, and of course you try and show them a little of what you're interested in. They take to it or don't take to it. My son, funnily enough, is reading The White Tiger right now at school.
Oh, lovely. How old is he?
He's 14, and so the teacher first tried them on Heart of Darkness, and they were just like, so dull, not at all relevant. And I'm like, it is so relevant today. But The White Tiger is really, really good.
And I love that you introduced Malgudi Days as well. I think, my generation certainly grew up on it. You're much younger. But I thought that was a lovely way of transmitting your love for reading and your love for words as well. And, how much of that is you, right?
I think it is all of us. And that's how I learned, right? From my parents and their love of reading and all of that kind of stuff. And I'm sure
your father's an author too, so...
Yeah, he's the author. I'm sort of an amateur, and many, many books behind. But the thing is, this is how you learn.
That's for public purpose. Privately, it's a different
Also,
story.
this is why
Is he Mr. Rastogi? No.
A little bit. Let's leave something for the reader's imagination, right?
Her parents are very much in the book, but I won't give the story.
Okay, so we'll have to do our own.
We won't do any spoilers.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. So, because, as a diplomat's child, you're a little like an army brat, right? You have to go all over the
I'm
world.
a refugee. I'm a very privileged refugee. Yes.
But I guess in a way, books sometimes do become your companions, right? So, was that true of you growing up as well?
I always read, and I was never very
I never discriminated with my reading. I'd read a menu. I was saying to my editor today, I'd read Feminine, find great pleasure in reading the Agony Aunt column.
Yeah.
For all manner of reasons. So I would read anything, and I think that serves you well. And of course, then books can be a friend when you're new in a new country.
Right.
And know no one, right? And you're just a new girl, you sort of specimen for the week. Books, I think. And funnily enough, then in a time like the pandemic as well, science saved our lives. That's meant that you and I can talk and sit next to each other today, right? But I think art really gave life meaning.
Yeah.
During
And made
this
it
time.
bearable.
Right. And funnily enough, everyone reacted in different ways. In those early weeks and months, I was unable to read. Not even a menu, right?
Yeah.
Like I was unable to read anything just because my concentration was shot, because your body was indulging in a fight or flight response. You had to, kind of manage everything, just marshal your resources, etc. Get the kids organized, get your work life organized, get your home life organized as well. So you didn't have the attention span for sitting and with even short stories like these. But things like art or podcasts or kind of TV shows or movies, whatever you had access to and were interested in, my God, that provided so much succor at that sort of time.
And love, which is really the underlying emotion in the book. I think love really did save us all, right, at the end of the day.
And that was it. It was contact, and in as much as, say, the vaccines or whatever greater knowledge of transmission really allowed us to interact. It was interaction that was the end, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's interesting to see all the women in the book are also in a way really actively looking for love, and some do find it and some don't. I'm happy for the ones who found it, so I'm glad you have a happily ever after for some of them. But the ambassador was talking about her dog a moment ago, and the woman who has those 28 dogs, right?
She's not fictional.
She is not fictional. Okay, she struck me as being one of the most remarkable characters.
She lives in
as well.
Gitanjali.
She does.
Opposite her parents' house.
Okay, she's quite a character, huh? Can you talk a little about her and this whole idea as well?
Kaveree, she might be sued for defamation.
There you go. Or you will be, right? I don't live in the country. It'll be you. But
no, she's not all bad. She does it.
She has a viewpoint.
Yeah,
doesn't she?
I mean, it's just the way she is.
She's
I know I'm
vociferous.
giving away quite a bit of the book, but that's also to encourage you to read it and not to sort of gloss over it, because it has some really very interesting characters. Sorry, and also their stories are all intertwined. A lot like they're all sort of linear, but they all sort of meet at some point, and I love that cinematic. It's almost cinematic in the way it's written, which is lovely.
So before dealing with the dog lady, let me just provide a bit of context. So like you said, it is a collection of interlinked short stories set just as the lockdown was announced.
Right.
So it is a community portrait, as it were. So you first go into one house, see how they're coping with lockdown and all of that kind of stuff, then into the neighboring house or someone who has contact with that house. And then in that way, you move through different houses and see how they're dealing with the pandemic. And the dog lady is a lady who's universally hated in the area just because she has so many dogs, and she's an animal lover, well, a dog lover, and she will not hear anyone tell her that humans have human rights too. Maybe it might disrupt kind of peace of mind to hear 28 dogs barking all through the night. But she will always tell you, dogs have rights too, and will assert those rights very, very loudly.
And there's a moment when your character tells her that she ought to put a muzzle on the dogs, and
which
she says,
as
how would
a
you
dog
like
lover,
a muzzle
right?
on you?
And you can understand that there's something as being reasonable, and she isn't necessarily always reasonable towards human beings, right? And which is unfortunate because she is living with human beings. I mean, I've never met the actual lady. I've never spoken to her, so she might be as unreasonable as everyone in the area thinks she is. But here I wanted to say what I would hope her point of view was, right?
Yeah.
And then she obviously has this daughter who's the object of fascination and interest to her neighbor, which leads on to the next, or one of the next stories, which you alluded to, right? In terms of anchors, of TV anchors being very shrill or very opinionated, when actually they didn't know so much more than we did, right? They were as educated as we were in the very, very early days of the lockdown.
And those are the women. The men are a mixed bag. Some, like Dhruv, are quite nasty pieces of work. And some are supportive and, the good guys. There were people like Dhruv as well. There are people like Dhruv as well. And much as we don't want them to be around, they are. I like the way the wife is coping with that or not coping with that. So a lot of relationships also sort of broke down during the pandemic. A lot survived, but a lot broke down as well. And we don't talk about that enough. Talk a little about this relationship, which is very,
it's fraught, isn't it?
Yeah.
And I think maybe we're not talking about it enough because we haven't really come to terms with the trauma that COVID unleashed on us. Maybe we will just move on from it, as we seem to be in a hurry too. But maybe the fallout from that will emerge, right? In the
and
years
I think
to come.
over a period of time, I think we'll see the impact over a period of time, especially on the kids. And I like that you mentioned that you have so much of the kids there, because I think the way it impacted their learning, the way it impacted their able to deal with other people was really, permanently impacted. And we may not know
We don't know today, right? Like
we don't know how it will pan out.
I know as a society we're growing less able to compromise, and this is globally. So this is not an India-centric observation. People are less able to see the opposite point of view, and that's partly because we were sequestered in our homes. We were cocooned, and if you were in a happy home,
if you were lucky.
But let's hope that enough people were in a functional home, so you were able to kind of foster your views and feel you were right. Because when you are in isolation, when you're not in your own, literally in your own echo chamber, and you're not listening to another point of view, then over time, an opposite or a different point of view grows to be malevolent, doesn't it? It's just wrong. It's just wrong, and I can't see how anyone else can think like that. And I'm seeing that emerge in society. And the thing is, I'm not a Gen Z. I'm not an alpha generation. I wonder how much worse it's going to be for them, right? And how much marked it's going to be for them. And maybe we're seeing it already with the US elections, right? And Gen Z voted, enough of Gen Z and enough of male Gen Z voted for Trump to I think give us pause and think, okay, maybe this generation has grown up differently. And of course, COVID is a huge part of that.
Yeah, and I think that is a very significant part of the book. And I wonder how many conversations did you have with psychologists, psychiatrists, people who deal with mental illness as well? Because there is a particular character here again who, typifies that young man who, is not sure what to expect now. That whole certainty of work, marriage, parenthood, that seems to have all been seems to have come apart. So how much of research did you actually do for this? It must have been quite considerable.
Well, I mean, so a lot of it was playing out in real time. So a lot of it was news articles. But then over the years as well, just talking to educationists and talking to, psychologists and child psychologists, and seeing how people are unable to hear a different viewpoint, right? Which you would think is is the bedrock of debate and interaction, right? Just talk to someone you find odious and maybe understand a bit of where they're coming from. And that seems to be harder to do for the younger generations, for Gen Z and even younger. So I did talk. I interacted, like I said, with educationists and psychologists, child psychologists in particular, and read widely around the topic. And, this was written in 2020, and I think this was already maybe looking into the future, because I don't think we are there yet or have sufficient knowledge of the fallout or how this is evolving.
Your earlier two books, the first one was about partition and a different kind of trauma. When you look back at those times and you look at us now, how much have we changed?
What, in terms of just rapid descent to hate?
Yes, and the othering of people?
Not at all. Okay.
Yeah.
Not at all. And what's interesting is people who live or did live in harmony together. And this is why it gives me such pause, the way it's the younger generation, I think, that is most affected by the growing partisanship and polarization. Because, when I was a child, the Berlin Wall was falling down.
Yeah.
Walls
There was so much
up,
hope,
right?
Right? I think
It was lovely. Yeah.
I mean, they were cataclysmic times, but
No.
there was so much change and hope in the air.
The Cold War
Yeah.
ended. I mean, lovely things happened. You looked forward to the future, and the future seemed better. But I think that was the last good point in recent history. And I think it's been, and I write here that at least millennial kids grew up with the hope of grew up in a good world. Gen Z kids just had, I don't know, the Bush years, the Iraq War years, the Afghanistan years, and it gets progressively worse and worse and worse. And if I just look at politics in the country I live in, you had David Cameron, and he kind of Brexit happened under his watch, and you sort of thought it can't get worse than him. And then in comes Theresa May, who's completely incompetent. Then comes Boris Johnson, who blows
I love that she's
Europe
not
up.
diplomatic at all.
Yeah,
So
not
good.
Not very hopeful, right now. No, but you sort of think it can get worse and worse and worse, and these kids are growing up in that environment, right? So it's very easy to judge them and call them miserable and not invested in the future, not working hard enough, or eating too many avocados, or whatever you say about them.
As the world goes to
Or
hell.
not saving and going on these foreign holidays, on loans and stuff. But we haven't left a really good world for them, have we? So, so you can't. And to your point about politics, it is all too easy, especially when you see this, and when you see kind of the 1918 pandemic was followed by this whole period of hedonism, and then of course the Second World War. You can see the kind of polarization even starting.
So I also love the way that you have different classes of people, and you have Chetan. It's a very interesting love life, and all playing out on the terrace, which is a sort of very old-fashioned kind of romance. Talk a little about Chetan, his mom calling him. He's torn between. Chetan is again, for readers, the person who works for Mr. Rastogi, the widower in the book, and really takes care of him.
Mrs. Manfredi.
Yeah. And I mean, his mom is calling him home because everyone else is going home, and he says, no, at least
Saloni is, across the roof.
Yes.
Right? So I'm not going home.
Saloni is a woman given to wearing diaphanous nightgowns in the and I think she's quite a tease.
She's quite a tease, and she's very, very aspirational for a boy like Chetan, because
I
the woman
love
she
that
works for is a
relationship.
TV star, right? So she's her house help, and so she has a bit of the glamour of her mistress, but
and she calls him a stalker,
which he doesn't know what
Yeah.
that means. because that's a long word in English, right?
Yeah.
So what does stalker mean? And then he's petrified when he learns
Yeah.
what the word actually means, because he thinks, I've been following her at a safe distance and I've never spoken to her. And obviously he's not a stalker because she is also interested in him.
But
though
he
had been
discovers
following
that
her.
later.
Yes.
He's like a Hindi film hero who doesn't
Right,
know
love
that
lore.
he's stalking the woman.
He's hapless and
Yeah.
hopeless, but then she gives him hope, and
Right.
it's very, very sweet. And actually, in the grand scheme of things, it's pretty chaste, though she does wear
Yeah.
those daphnes gowns, or maybe his imagination goes
Yeah.
into overdrive. But I'm very, very fond of her and him, and very fond of that story. And
Yeah.
and like you say, that's a happy love story, and he's a nice guy. So not all men,
Yeah.
and definitely not all men.
Yeah. There's this lovely man who
villains.
turns up at Pranav, right?
Oh, I'll tell you a story about Pranav. So this is
Yeah.
this,
Please tell us, because he seems an interesting person.
So
There are lots of interesting people in her book, actually. It's difficult to say who's the most charismatic, but Pranav is quite interesting. Talk a little about it.
So there's this girl called Niharika who's grown up in the area, and she's a child of the colony, as it were. She used to live with her mother, and her mother passed away.
Right.
And she thinks it was lucky that the mother passed away just
Yeah.
before, because she had some underlying health issues and she would not necessarily have coped very well with the pandemic. But in any case, Niharika is all alone. And like you said, you had the dog, and the dog was there to hug you, love you, right? The dog was there for you to touch you. This girl, because she's living alone, she's in isolation. She hasn't felt anyone touch. Like not. And I was saying to someone today, I said, no one's even slapped her, which is not a nice contact, but my God, that's contact. But no one has held her hand. No one has pushed past her in a crowd.
Yeah.
There has been no one has done this.
Yeah.
Right? So that is a very, very, very lonely place to be in. And she meets up on a Zoom call with her old school editorial board. And there is a boy in the class above her who she always had a crush on. She remembers he used to roll up his sleeves, and he had fluffy hair, and we don't know what he really looks like, but to her, he was this kind of old school hero. And he contacts her after the Zoom call, and he says, look, I have been out and I have had lunch with a friend, and we shook hands, and his wife then gave us hand sanitizer. Right? So we were able to make that contact, and that contact was so nice. So, she thinks two things. First, she says, the other guy's wife. So you haven't said anything about a wife yourself. So that gives her hope. But she's also so moved by the fact that he's reached out to her and he suggested a meeting. And of course, all her old feelings reemerge, or hopes reemerge. And it's an interesting development for her. And they meet. So Pranav and Niharika meet. He comes round to where she is, and of course, all of the uncles from around. I think it's uncles in this case. The men tend to be worse in this collection. They're watching. Who's Niharika meeting? Who's the strange boy, right? And so his hairline has receded, so he doesn't have fluffy hair the same way, but he's still Pranav, right? The guy in the year above her. And he shakes hands and he offers her hand sanitizer. And the book ends with the handshake. And the story is called The Handshake. And it's...
Yes.
And let me
just a couple of
story.
questions, and then we open to you.
And so I had a podcast a couple of weeks back, and the lady asked, she said, one final question. It's about Pranav. And I said, Pranav is Pranav, right?
Yeah.
And she goes, is he married? And that plummets me because, this is such a beautiful story. And I said, well, it's up to you. Maybe he's married, maybe he's a villain. It's up to you. But that gave me pause. That wasn't something I'd necessarily considered. But of course.
And the other one that I liked so much was Anchal and her dream of meeting up in Paris. And then she says, okay, without too much of a spoiler, actually books a holiday for her son and her
And her.
to Paris,
Yeah.
which again I thought, how many of us did that as well, right? I mean,
Just imagine
Yeah.
travel, right?
Yeah.
Which is why probably we're all rushing to travel
Yeah.
now. But yeah, I mean, it's whatever sustained you during
Yeah,
that time,
just-
right? Whether it was going to a museum in Paris or Rome or wherever you were happy.
Yeah.
Or imagined. And Anshul, of course, has never been to Paris.
Yeah.
But this was a big plan for
A big
of hers.
dream, a big plan.
And now maybe financially it's possible in a way it wasn't when she was planning this trip. You know, it sustained her during this time.
And the last question, I know we just discussed this before, but this idea which you said of hikikomori, am I pronouncing it right? This Japanese
Hikikimori. Yeah.
hikikimori. I didn't know of this. Thank you for adding to my vocabulary. The idea of young people withdrawing from society, which is what we sort of hinted at a little earlier. But I think that for me, again, is the big takeaway from this, something that we've not examined enough. And I mean, it's such a, you think, 160 pages, I mean, how much can she pack in, right? But you pack in a lot of ideas and a lot of things that we've not actually fully examined. And I think you pack in a lot in this book, which is really lovely, including this very interesting observation and interesting phenomenon, which again, we've not fully unpacked.
And like we've discussed, I think maybe it's a bit early to fully grapple
Right.
with the extent to which we're going to see this. And
Yeah.
I hope
Yeah,
it can
I mean,
be managed. But it's heartbreaking what happens with some Japanese youths.
Yeah.
They just withdraw from society. They have
No, I see it
virtual
around
girlfriends.
me as well, but we don't quite understand what's happening. This actually gives us pause and makes us think that perhaps this is what is happening, and we don't know.
And
we don't
this
understand.
might
it.
be one of the fallouts
Yeah.
from COVID. Yes. Yeah.
So lovely. I think we've dissected almost every character in the book, but I would urge you to not go by what I said, but please read it. It's lovely. You'll enjoy it. And it's cinematic. So, Kartika, do you have offers to make it into a web series? You should think about it. It'll make for an interesting web series for sure. Thank you so much. Over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. I think the audience was very interested by the discussion, and we do have a little bit of time to take questions from the audience. So, would somebody like to ask Radhika any question on her book? Which
Perhaps
is a really
one
interesting
writer
book.
would like to ask another writer.
Ambassador Lakshmi Puri.
I must confess, I haven't read the book yet, but I look forward to reading it and perhaps even writing a review. But
That'd be great.
no, but I don't know how wonderfully I think both of you have brought out, and you too, Ambassador Mukherjee, have brought out why this book is important to read. And it's a reminder of an era that we would rather forget, but we must remember lest we forget, because there are so many presences that need to be understood better from the prism of that experience. And you've brought that through storytelling, and that's the best way of retelling what happened then, and then to experience it in a different way. I also always feel that one looks back at that era with a sense of achievement, of having survived, but also having changed, even at this late stage. Even you're talking about Generation Z and Alpha. I was just talking about the vocabulary of Generation Alpha. The Instagram is full of them. But one thing I wanted to ask, because you also wrote your novel in 2020, this in novel, which, by the way, I'm also very intrigued by the format, because these are they are short stories, but they are interconnected. And so, how did you make the connections? I will, of course, read it and discover it for myself. But how did you conceive of the book? as discrete stories to begin with, and then you join them up? Or how did you really? Because there's something I'm working on, uh, fictionalized UN stories, but I'm still working on the interconnections. So how did you do that?
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for your extremely kind words, and your observation that we have to remember this time and what an achievement it was, because that's true too. It was such an achievement that we, as an entire globe, right, achieved, for want of a better word. Now, with these stories, it was a very interesting experience. It was so different to writing a novel, because you were able to explore viewpoints from so many different angles. And there's, like Kaveree mentioned, there's this universally loathed character, but she too gets her time in the sun. You get to hear things from her point of view, which you would think would not be credible, would not be possible. But I hope she is a sympathetic character, or her voice is authentic in her story. So it was a very different process to writing a novel. And once I'd written the first story, and it was the first story in the collection, so this is an interaction between an elderly man who's really inconvenienced by this young girl, 6-year-old, loud young girl who breaks his flower pots and all that kind of stuff. And she moves next door and she disturbs his sleep, and his, really carefully arranged routine. But then COVID happens, lockdown strikes, and she talks to him. She starts talking to him. She starts talking to him about books, and he remembers his daughter's childhood. And so once I'd written his story, I thought, well, I want to talk about the girl too, right? And then once I thought about the girl, I thought about her mother and what her experience was like moving into a new colony just before COVID, and how irritated she was, how inconvenienced she was by the, universally loathed dog lady. And then other doors opened to me, just automatically. And it was a really frenzied period of writing over the kids' school holidays. And one by one, all of the characters appeared, and they weren't strangers, because you sort of alluded to them. And also remote, but the thing is, it was home. So the area is not remote. So I know the geography of the area and the layout of the houses and all of that kind of stuff. So I knew, and the dog lady really is real, and I really hope you don't have any spies here. And you're really nice in the story. But so no one was really a stranger, because everyone is fictional. And that area has changed beyond recognition. Like I said, the houses are now multi-story flats, blocks of flats. So no one really is real life. But the characters presented themselves just because of the old man and that lovely, precocious, impossible, loud child next door. You just automatically knew who was next door, who was irritated by her, who was her friend, or who taught her. So Niharika is her teacher. So the lady who shakes hands and hasn't been touched by anyone for all of lockdown. So those characters just automatically presented themselves, and in that way it just became a community portrait, because all of these short stories are interlinked.
Any other questions, please, from the audience? Somebody would like to ask Radhika.
First of all, Radhika, congratulations for a wonderful book. And while I agree with a lot of what was said in your conversation, one of my observations about the pandemic and also how you brought it up a little bit was in the story of that elderly lady, Smita, I think her name was.
Yeah.
And, this whole idea of, how she was going to deal with life alone.
Yeah.
And I think that was a very poignant sort of story for me personally, having lost my dad last year and my mom having to deal with life alone. And so I wanted to also ask you where you drew inspiration for that character, because
there is a sense of, that you said a son is a son till you get him a wife, a daughter is a daughter for all alive, which is very true. I mean, we've all grown up with that in life.
I hope it's not. You have a son. I have a son, so I really hope that's not true.
We've grown up with that. We've all sort of grown up with that and sort of inherited that conditioning. But I think the pandemic threw that out of the window also, because the sons and the men also sort of got
Stepped
to
up.
learn how to make chapatis. And my husband back here, he was doing all the roti making and I was doing the rest of it. So how did you draw that? Where did you get that inspiration for that story? And then you also touched upon how she's figuring out her self-sufficiency, right? I mean, she's impacted by, what she thinks in the past, but she's also figuring out, okay, now how do I heal myself? How do I fix myself? And, so step 1, step 2, step 3. So there's a whole analysis on how elderly people living alone are figuring out in a calm, composed manner, okay, what are the steps to survival? Which I thought was very interesting and relevant, because it's relevant for all of us. How many of our kids are going to come back in any crisis or be able to come back and really help? So, can you tell me about that?
So where I live in the West, there's phenomenon called the loneliness epidemic. So this is where typically elderly men who have survived a deceased spouse find it hard to organize themselves, maybe don't socialize as much, they don't have the same sort of social networks maybe women institute. And if they're estranged from family, or if they don't have any other family, life is hard, and the day is very, very long. So I drew inspiration from that, and obviously I live far away from family, so that was on my mind. And with Smitha in particular, it's just the mechanics of it, right? You were cooking for 4, now you're cooking for 1, right? It's just, do you whip up a batch of malpure? Can you whip up a batch of malpure and have them over 6 days? Is it an enjoyable enterprise? Is it feasible now suddenly? So all of these, intricacies even of life, living alone, creep up, and those have to be dealt with and contemplated, right? And she faced a challenge in the story, and maybe that is something that a lot of us would have had to think about, or some of us would have had to think about at a time like this.
If you permit, Radhika, I'll ask you a question.
Please do.
Yeah. So, in your book, which is so beautifully written, you've talked about how to cope with solitude. So I'll give you a different spin, which is that those who have coped with solitude for a very long time, like me, I've coped with solitude now, total solitude, for 24 years, I think are able to manage a pandemic-like situation much better, because there is no family except 2 dogs, you see. So before the pandemic, there were 2 dogs. During the pandemic, there were 2 dogs. After the pandemic, there were 2 dogs, and now sadly only 1 dog. 1 dog has gone away. And so the day is not very long. The day is the same, because many of us who are totally alone, we actually turn to reading and writing, and or listening to music, and that keeps us sane. So when you were writing this book, I'm sure this thought must have crossed your mind, that those who are totally alone, where you come from now, London, may find solitude much more difficult to deal with than those who live totally alone in India, because the way we are brought up, perhaps, we can cope with total solitude better. So I'd just like to put that comment to you as Tota Auntie, and not as the president of IHC, because none of the uncles and aunties here have asked any questions yet. So over to you.
I think there's an important distinction to draw between solitude and loneliness, right? So you can be alone, you can be very comfortable in your own skin and with your own company. And I think that is something to achieve whether you are in a crowd or on your own. And I don't think being physically single necessarily has anything to do with it. It can do, but it's also a state of mind. And if one achieves that, I think that is a true goal. And that can be achieved in the West, it can be achieved here. And it goes back to a phrase I've used here, and of course it's been used in the past by the Prime Minister, Atmanirbharta, right? And if you have the discipline and the ability to be happy with your own company, my God, there's no greater gift.
Hi Radhika, my name's Rahul and I was a little late to this party. I haven't read your book. I look forward to reading it. But I'm curious to understand who are the authors who've influenced your style of writing? Who are the folks that you read? I'd love to know a little more about that.
Gosh, that's a great question with no easy answer. I read everything. And like I said, from menus to really, really big tomes that inspire me and awe me and then depress me because they're so well written. But largely speaking, I've really enjoyed the writings of W. Somerset Maugham. Some of the M. Foster, I've really, really enjoyed in terms of more contemporary authors, Elizabeth Strout, who also writes, this is my phrase, a community portrait, but interlinked short stories that give you the ability to access different people in a community or on a street or in a town. But yeah, equally, writers who I may not admire so much for their writing will teach me something, right? Whether it's space, whether it's plot, whether it's how to capture a reader's attention. So I think there are the greats, and I've named some of them, or there are people who are meaningful to me, and again I've named some of them, but there's so many others who have really, really fed into my work too.
But thank you very much. I think there is one more.
Wow. Hi, so I see there are some real stories and some are fictional. Some are real and some are fictional. I was just wondering, how did you judge them while writing these stories? Like, there is one story where a married woman goes back to her ex. Right? So as a reader, while I'm reading the book, it actually breaks the trust of the relationship, right? So you as a reader, how do you want us to read this thing? Do you want us to forgive it because it's COVID and stuff? Or like, how do you, while writing, do you have any morality behind it? Like, based on something? That's a question I want to ask you.
So all these stories are fiction. All of these stories are fiction. All of these stories are the work of my imagination. So there's no kind of moral dilemma there, as it were. But I think what I would love for people, and they're set in such a microcosm of such a small community in such a large city, right? So if you want to place them so specifically in one area, you can. But the thing is, we all have, say, someone we have a crush on, or that we all have the annoying neighbor, or we all have the irritating neighbor, like child next door who's too loud, or we all have the sweet kid next door, right? So all of us will recognize someone or the other in these stories. Like I said, everyone is fictional. Every interaction is fictional. Every story is a work of fiction. But hopefully, and this is what I'm hearing from people, everyone can recognize themselves in some story. So everyone has maybe an awkward interaction with an in-law that somehow grows happier over this time because they spend more time together. Maybe kids spend more time, or teenagers spend more time with family members. That there are unhappy marriages that stay unhappy, don't get easier, right, during this time. So I would very much hope, and this is what I'm starting to hear from people as well. Look, I know someone like this. I know a relationship that broke down. I know someone who bought a dishwasher, for instance, over this time. So a lot of people come back to me with and people really, really relate to different stories. And that's interesting too, to see what resonates with people.
This is even more inappropriate because I haven't read it. But I'd like to take issue with your claim that there's a sort of an exuberance coming after the pandemic. And there's a slight distinction between 1918 and the pandemic, because 1918, of course, came at the end of the Great War. And any exuberance in the 20s was perhaps something that replaced a war that had such an effect on many people. Now it seems, I'm wondering if there's a sequel to this, in the sense that the pandemic was actually the determined what will happen in the future. It just accelerated loneliness due to AI, sort of atomization, and things like that. I'm wondering what your next book is, viewed in that.
I've typically written a book and put it away and put the characters to bed and sort of really gratefully moved on with my life. But I'm getting asked this again and again with this set of stories, and I think different people resonate. But just going back to your earlier point about this being slightly, the euphoria following this point, being slightly different to what followed 1918. Of course, it was in the aftermath of the Great War. That's a point really, really well made. And of course, we didn't then have technology to grapple with, right? And like Kaveree really, really astutely pointed out, we haven't seen the end result, right, of the pandemic or the arrival of AI or the technological advances made during this time. So time will tell. And I really, really like to leave my characters in their, neat little book jackets and move on with my life. But I'm hearing this again and again about this book.
Well, thank you very much, Radhika, and I'd like to thank your publisher. I'd like to thank Kaveree. I'd like to thank all of you who came, including the cheerleaders. I'm one of them, of course. And I think this is a book which everyone should read. I was deeply moved when I read the book because, as I said, it brought back my own memories. And for each of you in the room, it will bring back your own memories and how each of you, like me, coped with a period of our lives that A, we never imagined would happen. B, we didn't know whether we would survive it or not. And then having survived it, I actually agree with your assessment that there was not really a euphoria. And the reason for that is because when we came out of it, we had lost so many near and dear ones that the euphoria was tinged, at least for me, with a lot of grief in my heart for so many colleagues, close friends and relatives who were no more. Sometimes the young people went to look after the elderly, and the elderly survived and the young person passed away. That was the saddest part of this pandemic. So thank you very much. And we have a rule here in Habitat, Director IHC will bear me out. We don't let anyone leave the building till they buy a copy of the book, right? This is a rule we've made. And so the book is outside. Please pick it up, and Radhika will, of course, autograph it for you, beginning with my own copy of the book. Thank you, Radhika.